why is it that the advice that you get in the doctor's office sometimes feels quite out of date compared to the research and what you're saying?
So, I mean, research teams have looked into what is the lag time between new evidence coming out and how long does it take for that to get incorporated into clinical practice. And this is like across disciplines, not just nutrition. The average is 17 years. And then if you extrapolate that to dietary guidelines, it takes a while for things to be, incorporated into practice, usually until we start seeing the guidelines shift. So there's an even longer gap there. At the end of the day, I mean, you could go all, way back in nutrition policy history into sort of the origins of why our guidelines are what they are. And when you really start poking into it, a lot of the recommendations were based on some faulty assumptions, maybe some research methods like, from the researcher Ansel Keys, who coined the diet heart hypothesis. He's also the original one who named what most clinicians think of as a Mediterranean diet. Anyways, there have been many other books written on the issues and the conflicts of interests and all the things that went into shaping what our dietary policy is, at least in the US. But most westernized countries are following very, very similar type of guidance. A diet low in fat, especially low in saturated fat, low in sodium. In recent years, it's been limit your animal protein. Emphasize fruits and vegetables, of course. That part I don't disagree with. But some of the sort of long-standing recommendations have taken priority over whole foods. So when you obsessively restrict fat and saturated fat intake, for example, you end up with a diet that's substantially higher in carbohydrate. The food industry responds by, okay, well, we took the fat out of everything and it tastes bad. So then they start adding sugar and, chemical ingredients to try to mimic the yummy flavors that you get from natural fat. And if you just kind of follow the epidemiology, what are the trends of what has happened to, obesity, diabetes, chronic disease over the years? It's only gotten worse, actually, since they implemented the diet policies. So there's certainly, of course, many other factors that can go into that. I'm not saying diet is the only one, but the trends and the correlation there is not ideal, to say the least.
Yeah, I can understand. And that's also why I'm so excited to have this conversation today, to really get down to what pregnant people in particular should be trying to incorporate into their diet and how they can eat in abundance and eat well to support themselves through this journey. So one of the things we really love most about this show is hearing from our listeners. We've collected lots of questions from our audience, and I was hoping to dive into that Q&A with you now. So we'll kick off with a question that came actually from an Australian listener, and it was something that I found particularly interesting, and it links quite well to what you were just explaining, is that she felt the guidelines were a bit confusing because in Australia, for instance, they tell pregnant people to avoid ham and sesame, which I think was due to the risk of listeria. But this person actually grew up in England where they don't mention anything about that. So she didn't know what to follow. And similarly, when speaking to the founder, Paula, in Finland, they say not to eat ginger. And yet in the UK, you have pregnancy supplements with ginger in them. So that kind of gives a bit of a context to my question, which is how strictly must a pregnant person follow the kind of standard list of forbidden foods? And when can common sense and context play a part?
It's a tricky question. As I've learned, I'm based in the US, so I'm very familiar with the US guidelines on what to avoid, what not to avoid. But I hear from people all over the world, and it's very interesting because the list of foods to avoid really differs based on what country you're in. So in the States, there's a really heavy emphasis on avoiding foods that are at high risk of listeria, although I found the Australian guidelines, they have a whole extra list of listeria risk foods that don't make it into the US guidelines.
Yeah.
So things like, deli meat, pate, soft cheeses, things like that usually are for a listeria risk situation. I've seen some lists in Australia that even have cottage cheese on there. Anyways. On the other hand, there's some countries I've heard in some parts of Europe and Central America where they're really strict on raw fruits and vegetables. In the US, we don't really have any avoid raw fruits and vegetables on our pregnancy guidelines, it's really focused on the raw and undercooked animal foods. But in other countries, they're like, don't eat salad, don't eat raw pre-cut fruits and vegetables. So, you take your pick. From what I've seen in the States, I think we are a little bit more strict on foods. Like we have a pretty broad range of foods that you need to avoid for various food safety reasons, or potentially there's some heavy metal concerns with certain kinds of fish. And when you start to look at the evidence on like, okay, what is the incidence of, say, getting a salmonella infection from eggs, or like the chance that an egg is carrying salmonella that could make you sick. Not that it will, but that it could. It's like the chance that an egg has salmonella is like 1 in 12,000 to 1 in 30,000 eggs. So it's very unlikely, even if you eat eggs every single day, that you're even going to come across a single egg that might have salmonella in it. And as a whole, in the States, that eggs account for less than 2% of foodborne illness outbreaks. Whereas raw fruits and vegetables, which aren't even on the list to avoid in the States, that accounts for 46% of foodborne illness outbreaks in the US. So it's just a little bit arbitrary what ends up on the list. Furthermore, there have been some studies, there's actually several out of Australia specifically, where they've looked at, okay, for women who closely adhere to Listeria avoidant food lists, what is the quality of their diet and how good is their nutrient intake? And consistently across these studies, they find that the more strictly these women adhere to Listeria guidelines and are avoiding huge swaths of otherwise healthy foods, the lower their diet quality and the lower their vitamin and mineral intake. And so it just kind of begs the question, like, are we being a little too cautious here? Like, there's a risk-benefit equation to anything. Of course, we don't want pregnant women getting Listeria. If the infection's severe, it's very dangerous for mom and baby. However, the relative risk of getting that sickness is low. And what are the risks of being nutrient deprived? We know that low nutrient diets can impede brain development in their baby, for example. And so it's just, I don't really like to give people very specific, yes, you can always eat this food, yes, this food is always a risk, because it really depends. We need to think about quality, sourcing, handling. So much, at least in the US, of foodborne illness outbreaks are from food that's prepared or consumed outside of the home. So if you're cooking things from home in your own kitchen, you're probably a little bit cleaner and have better handling standards than maybe something prepared in a commissary kitchen, or something you're getting in, I don't know, a buffet line at an event or something else. So that's where we just kind of have to use, a little bit of common sense in determining what feels safe to you, what doesn't, and maybe consider, what are the local risks in your exact food economy in your country, because it might be different than somewhere else.